Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. As you can see, or as you can read by the title and what it says here on the screen, this is a Radiant Dawn tier list. We're going to be doing that today. Now I said a few times that instead of doing a tier list, I was going to do sort of a character evaluation. I started doing that. I actually lost some of the footage that I was putting together for that. I'm just going to do a tier list. I'm lazy and I think people enjoy tier lists. As always with tier lists, it's really important to hear what I have to say about the characters rather than exactly where they go on the list itself. But yeah, we're just going to do a tier list. Tier lists are fun to do. I want to go through a few things before we start though. The big reason that I didn't want to do a tier list was actually, as it says here, availability in Radiant Dawn. Radiant Dawn is a weird ass Fire Emblem game. Availability is always important for character evaluation, but it's usually like, you get a character early, you get a character late, you get a character in the mid game, and that's going to affect how strong they are, right? Because being available for a longer period of time is always a good thing. In Radiant Dawn, character availability ebbs and flows so much. Characters are available for a little bit, then they leave for a long time. You know, they're available for a few chapters here and there. So a lot of character evaluation kind of comes down to when they're available, they're good, and when they're not, they're not. So where exactly they fall on a tier list, that's why I think it's a little weird. But again, I think that's why it's important to listen to what I have to say rather than exactly where I put the units. But that's why I didn't want to do this initially. But yeah, I also want to talk about my own history with Radiant Dawn. I've done tier lists for all the GBA games, and I feel a lot more confident about my perspectives there. Played through those a million times. I've only completed one Iron Man on hard mode in Radiant Dawn, and then we mostly recently just did a Tin Man because I messed up the first Nephany and Braum chapter. The early game in Radiant Dawn can be very difficult. So that's my history. I've played through the game a million times on the easier difficulties when I was younger, but I'm not as much of an expert as the GBA games. So yeah, just keep that in mind. This tier list is also going to orient toward hard mode, and specifically Iron Man's just, I don't know, who's useful if you're just playing the game normally, not like an efficiency-based tier list, anything like that. So that's what I'm orienting toward. And then I want to talk a little bit about the tiers, and we can get into actually the tier list. And hello, there's me. Yeah, the tier list. So I just want to talk about that. S, obviously the best. S rank units are absolutely insane. In fact, only one unit is going to be S rank in this game. You should use them every time. They're just absolutely incredible. You probably know who that is, but we'll get to it. A rank units are fantastic as well. They don't break the game like S rank units do, but they're fantastic. I would use them every single time. They really don't have anything wrong with them. They're just not quite on that tier. B rank units have something slightly wrong with them. They like don't maybe scale the best, or they take a while to get scaling, or they have bad, you know, kind of mediocre availability. But I would still recommend using B rank, B tier units in most playthroughs. C tier units are pretty generic. There's going to be a lot in this game, I think, so get ready for that. But yeah, they're units that like have availability problems. Hint, hint. There's a lot of that in this game. I use most of them on most playthroughs, at least for a little bit, but they're more niche. So I wouldn't recommend using them on every single playthrough, but they can be useful. And then D tier units are the worst in the game. They either have pretty significant availability issues or are just pretty bad in some way. And I may be adding an F tier as we progress. I don't know if anyone in this game necessarily deserves F tier. There's some stinkers in this game, but we'll talk about it as we progress. And yeah, I wanted to, and this is actually part of the reason I didn't add F tier immediately, because I want all the characters to be on screen. Although I suppose I could lower it a little bit if we want to add an F tier. Maybe we should just add an F tier, because I want people to be able to see what I'm about to talk about or what I am currently talking about before I rank the units. Yeah, let's add an F tier. We probably should, right? I was actually thinking there's actually a very specific character. I'm gonna have to add this a little bit. Okay, and then I'm gonna decrease this a little bit. Sorry, should have done this if I was a better content creator. Would have done this before I started, but whatever. Yeah, there's one unit, one cat unit that I'm currently looking at that I think belongs in F tier. But anyways, I've wasted enough time. Let's get into the tier list. Let's start with Nolan. I like Nolan a lot. I think Nolan's fantastic. I'm gonna put Nolan in A tier. He is one of the first units to be recruited in the game, actually, after Micaiah, Leonardo, and Edward on chapter. I guess it's one technically because there's a prologue. You get Nolan. He is basically the strongest combat unit of the very early game outside of Soth, which I like a lot. I love Nolan. I think when you're playing on hard mode, one of the big differences between hard mode and the other modes in Radiant Dawn is you get access to a lot less experience. So I think in the Dawn Brigade, you really want to train two units, Nolan and question mark. But I think Nolan is always there. It's one of the reasons I think he's so great. And I think he's good early in the game, which I think is fantastic. He's really easy to train. He comes at a good level. Also, Nolan gets to use crossbows, which for those that don't know, two of the Chapter 3 Dawn Brigade chapters feature Laguz heavily. The first one is the only one where it's really useful to be able to kill them because the second one's just a defend chapter. But crossbows in this game are pretty shit. They don't they have might, but they don't get plus by your strength, so they don't scale with the unit. So they're okay early, but as the game progresses, they're really terrible. But because their might is so high, when you get effective damage, they're nuts, right? So if you use Beast Foe on Nolan and then get to part 3, you can use the crossbow to just deal tons of, like, you can one-shot Laguz, basically all Laguz, if you're promoted. So, and he's the best at this. Technically, Leonardo can do this. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, that's really valuable. And again, I just think Nolan is always one of the units you should train. He also gets access to the Tarvos. 3 units get unique weapons when you enter part 3 of the Dawn Brigade. Leonardo, Edward, and Nolan. The Tarvos is probably the best. I guess the bow is kind of better, although Leonardo kind of blows. We'll talk about that more later. But the Tarvos gives +4, I think, defense, and it's really strong. So a great weapon to have in part 3. We'll talk more about the Dawn Brigade as we progress, but Nolan, I think, is like, honestly, to me, maybe the best unit in the Dawn Brigade. Like, I think he's fantastic. Easy A tier. Highly, highly recommend using him on every playthrough. I think he is my must train every single time. Okay, next up we have Kurth. Oh man, so Kurth, again, availability. Kurth is available extremely late in the game. He's really weak. You do have to bring him to the end game, so it's hard to say that he's like useless. And he does have one of the pool abilities. I think his might give defense. I don't know. If I was smarter, I would have researched this. It gives something. It's hard to say that he's good. I don't think he's an F tier unit just because he has that pool and you have to bring him, so he does have some use. Is he an F tier unit? He eventually gets form shift, but that's like nothing. You can train him. Is Kurth F tier? I don't know. His niche is so small and he's so worthless. I'll put him in F tier. Like, if he's not an F tier unit, then who is, right? Technically, he is useful on the final 5 chapters, but outside of giving that pool ability, he's got nothing going for him. So I don't know. I'll put him in F. Maybe belongs in D. I don't think it really matters. Then we have Yulki. So Laguz in this game in general, I would say, are not as good as they are in Path of Radiance, but there are a few outliers. Yulki and Janaf are both definitely outliers. Their stats are really high. Bird Laguz, I don't think they untransform as fast as Cat Laguz. I don't know how fast they do. They also come very close to level 30, so you can use a Satori sign if you want. And they're a great class, as long as you're not getting attacked by crossbows. So I think Yulki's pretty fantastic. I think he's the better one of him and Janaf, because I think his ability ups a Void, if I'm not mistaken. And Janaf's, I think, ups hit, which is pretty useless. Maybe a B tier unit. He's not like that. It's tough because he is recruited rather late in part 3, and part 3 Ground Mercenaries don't really need help. So maybe he's a C tier unit, but I think him and Yulki are strong enough to where they can be B. They are really good. I would highly recommend using them, and you can train them. Then we have Ranulf. So Ranulf is actually kind of similar. He's recruited earlier, but in part 3, and he's a pretty high level and pretty strong Laguz. The problem with Ranulf is that he's a cat, and cats in this game lose or gain 4 Laguz gauge like every turn, and I think depending on combats, they just, like, Ranulf will transform and the next turn he'll be untransformed. It's so annoying to deal with. He does have good enough stats to where it's hard for me to say that he's like useless. Is he quite a B tier unit? He's recruited earlier. I could see him being B tier. Like, you have to deploy him a couple of times and he's good to deploy. I think I'll put him C tier though. I definitely think he's worse. And like, because he's a Laguz, you have to use Claw, so no 1-2 range, and it's pretty weak. It's hard for me to say that he's B tier. I think he's pretty mediocre. I'll put him in C tier, but you will get use out of him. Like, I would recommend using him. Then we have Enna. Enna is basically just the same as Kurth. On the plus side, the dragons don't attack either of these units on the dragon final chapter, which is kind of funny. Again, maybe these two should be D because they have their pool abilities. Maybe they should be F. I don't know. I don't really care, to be honest. I don't think it's that interesting to talk about. So then we have Lyre. So Lyre is the reason that I wanted to make an F tier. I'm going to put her in F tier. Lyre has so many problems. She's a cat, which I just mentioned is really, really bad. She's recruited not too late in part 3, which is nice, but she's like a weaker version of Leith. And we'll talk about Leith later, but Leith is good in part 2, not in part 3, and Lyre's just worse. So it's really hard to say that anything Lyre does is remotely good. She's just terrible. She untransforms really fast. She has terrible stats. Her speed isn't even good enough to double at base, and she can't do any damage. So I don't know what you're supposed to do with her. She's pretty atrocious. Might be the worst character in this game. I actually kind of think she is. We'll talk about that more later, but yeah. Then we have Khalil. Okay, Khalil is our first Crimean Knight, or at least Crimean Knight attached unit. And I want to talk about that because the Crimean Knights have really bad availability. They are available for 1 chapter and then kind of a 2nd chapter in part 2. Although actually Khalil is not available for their 1st chapter, but is available more on the last chapter, which is kind of cool, but also kind of bad. Either way, she has bad availability. She's only available for like one chapter in part 2. And then they come back in part 3 for one chapter, but at that point, everyone not named Joffrey has like completely fallen off. And then you finally get them really late in part 3. The point is, Crimean Knights are really hurt by availability. And Khalil, unfortunately, is that. Khalil is also a Sage. Sages can't heal in this game, and magic isn't the strongest. So I'm going to put her in a solid D tier. You can certainly put effort into her, but Sage and Archsage or whatever is not a particularly good class. And she's just weak. Her availability is really bad. I like Khalil, but yeah, no, she's really bad in this game. All right, then we have Titania. Titania is amazing. Not quite the S tier, you know, one of the best units in the game that she was in Path of Radiance. But considering how many good units there are on the Grail Mercenaries, the fact that she actually stands apart is really impressive. Is she better than Nolan? Is she worse than Nolan? I think Nolan's better just because I think the Dawn Brigade is more difficult. But yeah, Titania comes as a level 16 Paladin, which is so ridiculously high. One of the sort of rules of thumb with this game is if you can get a unit to tier 3, they're insane, right? Not in the like end game, but at least for part 3, anytime you can get a unit to tier 3, they're ridiculously strong. And Titania can get to tier 3 extremely fast, coming level 16 Paladin. Which is really, really fantastic. She has good stats. She has really high strength, which is fantastic. And once, even though she struggles to double at first, once she promotes, she will double most things, at least for part 3. Once you get to part 4, you know, maybe a little bit weaker. But yeah, she hits hard. She gets to use axes, which is fantastic. Probably the best unit of the Grail Mercenaries, minus maybe Ike, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, fantastic, fantastic unit. Love Titania. All right, next up we have Leanne. Oh man, how do you want to rank the Herons? Leanne is she the best Terran? Is she not the best Terran? Raphael, I think, has the worst availability. I'm just going to put her in A. I don't know. Say what you want about the Herons. So all the Herons are different in this game. Leanne is, she can Gelder or dance or whatever you want to call it for somebody above and behind her or left and right, which is really good. She can do that untransformed and she can fly. She's probably the best of the Herons. Like Rayson can only do it to one person around Rayson, but then when Rayson transforms, he can do it to everybody. And then Raphael can do it to everybody, but he doesn't fly. Also, Leanne, I think, has the best availability of the Herons, so Leanne's probably the best. But yeah, they're all great. Herons get a little bit of extra stuff in this game. I think they can still heal everyone around them like they could in Path of Radiance, but you can get a Gelder that called Bliss that increases biorhythm, which can be pretty useful. You can get one that increases Laguz gauge. I don't think this really changes the Herons because the chances of you using any of this stuff is like pretty slim. It's not more useful than dancing, but it's kind of cool. So I don't know. She's probably the best of the Herons, so, but they'll all be an A. In fact, I can just do this right now. We don't need to wait for them to come up. I don't know which one's best. I think Raphael has the worst availability, so I'll put him last. As far as which one you should bring to the tower, I think Raphael's probably the best, just because you don't have to transform him and he can immediately dance for everyone around him, which is great, but it's up to you. They're all great. They're all great. All right, next up is Peleus, a unit that I never use on Iron Man's because I never use a file that's already beaten the game. Peleus is kind of like Khalil. He's really pretty bad availability and pretty bad base stats. I'll probably just put him in D. I think the fact that you can actually train him and he'll be okay probably omits him from F. Like, he can do stuff at base. He is also your only access to dark magic, other than Sephiran, so that's kind of cool. But yeah, not much to say. All the same problems as Khalil and bad availability. Next up we have Rolf. I don't think Rolf quite belongs in F tier, just because even at base he can do a little bit of chip damage, which is pretty valuable, especially in an archer. Rolf's thing is that he has really exceptional growths, but comes really, really weak as only a level 1 sniper. And again, the problem with hard mode in this game is that your experience gain is really low. So a growth unit like this is just not where you want to be. Also, sniper is a terrible, terrible class. Maybe he should be an F. I'm going to put him in, not C. I'm going to put him in D, but we're maybe like, maybe his use is worse. Maybe I should put him in F. He's really bad. Like, the problem again is that, Archer and Marksman are such bad classes that even if you put in the investment and he ends up being strong, like, we'll talk about a unit who is an Archer but still isn't very good, even though their stats are insane. You probably know who I'm talking about. And Rolf isn't that, so he's bad. He's really bad. Then we have Bastion. Bastion's another character that could be an F, but because his availability is really bad, but he can hit pretty hard and he's pretty bad. I'll put him in D. He can do stuff, right? It's hard to put him in F. He can actually do things, even though his availability is really bad. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't recommend using Bastion. Although honestly, like once you get to part 4, a unit like Bastion, even though he's only available for that one part 4 chapter, is still probably better than like most of the units you brought, especially in hard mode. So yeah, I think that probably means he's a D tier unit, not an F tier unit. Yeah. Then we have Marcia. Unfortunately, Marcia goes from being one of the best units in Path of Radiance, maybe the best unit in Path of Radiance, to a pretty mid to bad unit, because she's tied to the Crimean Knights, and that means her availability is terrible. She's not good on the Crimean Knights either. I guess she's pretty comparable to Khalil in most ways, so I'll put her next to Khalil, but yeah, she's bad. Again, the problem with the Crimean Knights is she's good on that first chapter in part 2, but she's only available there and everyone's good. And then in part 3, when you're re-recruiting them, and even in that part 3 chapter for the Crimean Knights, she's really bad. So not a very good unit. Next up we have Mist. Mist is an interesting unit. Unfortunately, she lost her horse in between games, which really sucks. She'd be a lot better if she was mounted. Healing is not that important in this game. That's something I'm going to mention. Healing in this game with non-stabs is maybe the best it's ever been in Fire Emblem, or up there. Like, herbs are 10 uses heal 10, vulneraries are 8 uses heal 20, which is crazy. Concoctions are 6 uses heal 40, elixirs are 3 uses heal everything, which is really good. You're going to use those a lot more than you're going to heal. So a unit like Mist, I'd normally put, like B tier, like it's nice to have a healer, and mages can't heal until they get to tier 3. Still useful to have a healer early in the Grail Knights, Grail Mercenaries, I should say. But I don't think quite B tier, maybe C tier. You'll heal with her a decent amount, so it's hard to say that she's useless, but it's not as important as it is in some other Fire Emblem games. All right, next up we have Astrid. Sorry, when I said that Lyra was the worst character in this game, I forgot about Astrid. Astrid, similar to Marcia, very unfortunate, goes from one of the better characters in Path of Radiance to probably the worst character in this game. She is awful. Unfortunately, she has the same problem Khalil and Marcia has, where she's tied to the Crimean Knights, making her availability really bad. And she is the worst of the Crimean Knights by a lot. She's a terrible class. She can only use bows until she promotes, and her base stats are terrible. Even her growths are pretty weak. She has like a 35% speed growth. She does have Paragon, but which unfortunately you can't take off. But yeah, you just don't have enough time to do anything with her. She's terrible. Awful unit. I think the worst character in this game. Very unfortunate for a character. And her character itself comes down to like just defending Makalov over and over again, which is kind of sad. Kind of a fall from grace for our girl Astrid. Very unfortunate. They said we have Volug. So Volug is, I think, either an A or a B tier unit. Volug, kind of like Nolan, and we'll talk about this with Soth, is one of the best combat units for the Dawn Brigade, which is so important because the Dawn Brigade is the most difficult portion of the game. I think that probably makes him an A tier unit. I don't want to put him in B. He's amazing. He's recruited a little bit later than a character like Nolan, but he's amazing in part 1, and he's still really useful in part 3 because you get to full transform him with, especially Alibi glasses can make him really good. So maybe you should be like up here. I don't think he's as good as Nolan. I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong. But he's amazing. Yeah, I value being good with the Dawn Brigade so highly because for me, that's the most difficult portion of the game. So like Volug quite a bit. Next we have Kai'Sa. So Kai'Sa is basically Lyre, but slightly better because he's a tiger, but pretty much the same. I'll put him down here with Lyre. Tigers are better than cats because they untransform slower, and his base stats do let him do something where Lyre could do nothing, but they're still really weak. One of the benefits of Laguz in this game is because you double all your stats when you promote, or not when you promote, when you transform. Every level up you get is essentially 2 stats, but that doesn't really save, I think, Kai'Sa from being terrible. There is a chance that I'm putting too many units in F tier. Like, to be honest, Kai'Sa, Rolf, Enna, and Kurth could all be in D tier, and I wouldn't blame you. In fact, they probably should be, but I don't know, fuck it. This is how we're making the list. This is one of the things, this is a quick aside. I know I'm taking forever here, but this is one of the things about making a tier list. Like, I don't have a defined way of making this tier list. I didn't like make it beforehand. So honestly, a lot of these, and this is why it's so much more important to listen to what I have to say rather than like look at the tier list itself, even though I know a lot of people don't want to sit here and listen to me. Totally understand that. But like, depending on the day, all 4 of these units would be in D tier and not F tier. So I don't fucking know, The point is they're not good, all right? That's what I'm trying to get across. Next up we have Tabarn. So Tabarn in Path of Radiance, it's hard to say that he's really that fantastic because he's only available for a few chapters. But in this game, you get him, he's amazing in part 4 and then really good in part 5. I don't think he's available enough for him to be like a B or an A tier unit. Maybe B though. Like he's so good in part 4. He's like the best unit by a lot for 2 chapters, and then he's still really good in the final. Yeah, it's hard to say that's a C tier. Yeah, I think that's a B tier unit at the very least. I don't think he's A just because I don't think any of the Laguz Lords are going to be A just because their availability isn't good enough. But like maybe he should be C. I don't know. He's good. He's good. And the fact that he gets those 2 additional chapters of availability. Tavarad's amazing. Boring unit because he's just amazing. You should use him every time. Next up, we have Boyd. Boyd is unfortunately not one of the better Gradel Mercenary units. In fact, he's definitely one of the worst. Boyd scales really, really well because he'll eventually get good speed and he has really good strength. He also has really good caps, but his base sets are just really weak. Like, you have to get a lot of speed in order to start doing anything. He'll get doubled actually pretty quickly. He doesn't hit that hard. I think he's a D tier unit, maybe top of D. He's just really bad. Sorry, I think my beard is going into my nose and it's making it really itchy, so I apologize that I keep picking my nose, but he's just really bad. Like, the fact that he's just like good and available for a few chapters is nice, but then again, Kalula and Marcia basically have that same thing going on. I don't think he belongs in C. He's pretty bad. Then we have Tormud. Tormud is one of the most availability screwed units in this game. It's hard to say that he's garbage because he is good for the few chapters he's available in part 1, but he may as well not be a unit when he's re-recruited in part 4. For those that don't know, Tormud is a pretty reasonable looking unit in part 1, but isn't re-recruited until the second to last chapter in the game. Technically the second to last chapter in the game, not actually. And he's terrible at that point. In fact, one of my favorite things about Radiant Dawn is the fact that they give him Baloney, I think, which has like, it requires like A tier fire, which he just won't have under any circumstances unless you're like insane. So I think for how useful he is during part 1, he still doesn't belong in F. So I think I'll put him in D, but you're basically looking at a unit that's only available for part 1, for a few chapters in part 1, which is pretty bad. But again, for me, he's useful in part 1, and part 1 is more difficult than part like 3 for Rolf, or like 4, 5 even for Kurth and Enna. That's why I'm making this distinguishment, because again, I value part 1 a lot more than later parts. Next up, we have Heather. So in our last playthrough, I actually tried to make Heather work. I gave her Bane, which of course she gets naturally, and then Adept and Daunt, and I tried to get her to proc it a lot. The problem is, once Heather goes down to bad biorhythm, she refuses to proc anything. This is all irrelevant. The point, whether you're trying to make her work or not, she's really bad. It's not important to have a rogue in this game at all, not useful. And even though they did flesh out the whole knife dagger thing, which is really cool, and I appreciate that they did that, ultimately they're just worse than every other weapon in the game. So, and if you're playing it hard, weapon triangle doesn't exist anyway. So the fact that knives are outside of the weapon triangle isn't useful or unique. So I don't think she's quite an F tier unit, just because part 2 is actually kind of difficult and she can do something in it. So I think D tier for her, but she's really bad. I would not recommend using her. Next up, we have Elencia. I wish Elencia was available for more in this game because she's cool. I feel like she's almost thrown by the wayside. You don't have to bring her to part 5. She's not the main character of part 4. Tabarn is. She's not even available. She's only available for like 2 chapters in part 2, which is really unfortunate. I mean, when she's available in part 2, she's okay. And then when she's re-recruited in part 4, she's like, okay, but she's a pretty bad unit. It's hard for me to say anything better than like D. She doesn't really do anything. Like, she could be kind of strong with the Amity. The Amity is really cool if you train her, but she's pretty garbage. Like, I would recommend using her when she's available, I guess. But even then, like, all she can do is heal. And we just talked about how that isn't that valuable. So I don't think she's really that good, unfortunately. Then we have Tyranio. So Tyranio has very weak availability, but when he's available, he's really good in part 1, and then he's available for 2 of the chapters in part 3. You can also Master Crown him for the final chapter of part 3, and he's pretty darn good. Should he be C or should he be B? I think the fact that he's good, especially in part 3, which is I value quite a bit, makes him a B tier. He's not A, not available enough to be A, but I do think him being good. Once you get to part 4, he's pretty much useless. Don't worry about that. But again, having use during the Dawn Brigade chapters is really valuable to me. So I think I'm going to put him in B. Oscar is definitely one of the more mediocre Grub Mercenary characters. He doubles quicker than Boyd, so I think that makes him a better unit. I think that makes him C tier, but he's weak just like Boyd on Recruit. It does require you to train him, and again, training people on hard mode is difficult, but I think he is a little better than Boyd, so I'll put him in C instead of D. And he also has better movement, which is great. Gifka is basically another Laguz Royal. He comes with Laguz gems, so he essentially has form shift. He's really useful at the end of the game. The question is, what am I going to do with the Royals? Like Kanangus. I think I'll put the Royals that aren't available outside of the endgame into C. Gifka is amazing in the endgame. Don't get me wrong. I would highly recommend using him, but his availability is just not good enough to have him any higher, or I think lower than C. Next up, we have Laura. So Laura is your only healer in part 1, outside of like sacrificing on Micaiah. Again, healing isn't that important, but it's pretty useful to have, especially early in the game, where you don't want to spend a ton of time using healing items you might not even have. Where does that put her? Again, just being useful during the Dawn Brigade, especially in part 1, makes you a pretty valuable unit to me. So I'm actually going to put her somewhere in B, maybe even top of B. She's useful. She's good. I just talked about how healing isn't good, so this is kind of funny to put her that high, but she's good. I wouldn't recommend like really promoting her or anything, but yeah, I will say healing when you get to part 3, Dawn Brigade, a little less useful as well because there are physic bishops available, not available, but with you on every chapter. So the ability to heal isn't as crucial because they'll take care of that. Also, Micaiah can heal once she promotes for part 3. So Laura's job does take a back burner. In fact, she's not very useful in part 3, but I still think being useful in part 1 is valuable enough. And then she is still, there in part 3. So, okay, next up we have Nisala. Nisala is a worse to Barn, but he is available in part 4, which I do value. So I think for those purposes, I will put him in B, just like Tabarn. I'll probably just put him like right next to Tabarn. I don't think he's enough worse than Tabarn to put him in C. Like I do value being available in part 4, but he is a lot worse in the tower. Like he is the worst Laguz Royal, but he has really high speed. Fuck it, whatever. He's good. Use him when you can use him. I don't care. Whatever, man. Then we have Devdan or Danvid. I don't know which one it is in this game. I'm sorry. He is unfortunately stuck to being Crimean Knight, so I'm just going to stick him with the Crimean Knights. I would say he's pretty comparable to these two, even though he's a worse class. Again, good on the chapter in part 2, but completely falls off a cliff in part 3 when he's re-recruited. Maybe these characters should even be F tier. I don't know. Whatever. He's not very good. I wouldn't recommend using him. Then we have Renning. Renning is kind of in this category of like units that are recruited extremely late in the game, and you can basically only use in the tower. In fact, Rennie you can literally only use in the tower. So how do you want to rank him? The nice thing is that his bases are strong enough to where he's actually like fairly strong in the tower. So if I'm putting all the units that are only available in the tower but busted in C tier, and I'm putting the units that are only available in the tower but actually kind of useful in F tier, that would make Renning definitely an F tier unit. Yeah, maybe somewhere around here. Again, there's a chance that Kurth and Enna should be in D tier, but yeah, Renning has to be F tier. He is really just like a worse Laguz Royal, and Laguz Royal is not someone you want to compare yourself to, so yeah, pretty bad. Then we have Rice. Rice is very similar to Mist. His healing is better, and I think he can deal a lot more chip damage. So I think he's a lot better than Mist, but they serve a very similar role, so it's hard for me to differentiate. He can heal. That's nice. Not super valuable, but that's nice. Next up, we have Ike. Ike is good. Ike is insane once you get the Ragnar and once he promotes, but he can't do that until part 4. In part 3, he is pretty good. The problem is you can't get that insane spike to a tier 3 unit like Titania can. I don't think that makes him worse than Titania. I just don't think it like makes him infinitely better. I don't think he's an S tier unit, even though he is ridiculously good at the end of the game. But the problem is once Ike gets really good, you also get a bunch of Laguz Royals. So is he really that valuable? Probably not. He is still really good in part 3. Definitely one of the best, probably the second best to Titania in the Mercenaries. But again, he can't promote. Maybe he is worse than Titania. I'm okay with just putting him at the end. Whoa, not F, not S. Again, like it's hard. I think Ike's problem is that there's no real point where he's like the best, right? Like he's not the best in part 3, even when he gets the Ragnar, because he can't get to tier 3, and you have all these tier 3 units that are ridiculous. And he is definitely the best unit in part 4, though. I'll give him that. On his team, he's definitely the best unit in part 4, but that's only 2 chapters. And then he's not really the best unit at the end of the game because you have Laguz Royals. So I'm trying to like convince myself that he's not, high A. But don't get me wrong, he is still amazing. He's still strong in part 3. He's amazing in part 4, the best unit on his team, and he's still really good in the tower. It's just I don't think he's ever like the best unit other than part 4. So I think low A tier. You should use him though. 100% use him. Train him by all means. Next up, we have Vika. Vika is actually my most disappointing unit in this game. It's really cool that they gave us a crow that we can use early on. Nelucci too. I love you too, buddy, but Really cool that they gave us a Crow. And if she's available for the Dawn Brigade chapters once you get to part 3, I might value her a little bit higher. But she's not. She's got the same availability as Tormud, and she's worse early on. So unfortunately, I think I am going to have to make her an F tier unit. Yeah, maybe top of F because she does still have some use, especially on the Prisoner chapter of part 1, but she's pretty darn bad. Then we have Makalov. Makalov is just terrible. You know, Danvid is at least useful on that part 1 or part 2 chapter, and then can hold his own sort of in part 3. Makalov is just straight up useless. He's terrible. I don't think he's as bad as Astrid, but he may as well be. He's just bad. He's just really bad. He's a slightly better Astrid, which does not amount to a whole heck of a lot here. Okay, next up we have Meg. I don't think Meg is the worst character in this game. I know people like to meme on Meg and Fiona, and we'll talk about her, but the reason that I don't hate the two of them is because they're available on part 1, and Meg in particular is available pretty early in part 1. And again, part 1 is tough. Just having a body that can suicide, not suicide, that can like take hits for you, or you know, like she's an armor, her base speed isn't the worst. It's pretty bad. She is terrible, but just being a body in part 1, I think makes her okay. I still think she's an F tier unit. Don't get me wrong, especially if I'm putting all these units in F. I'm definitely putting Meg in F. But I don't know, she can do something at least. Next up we have Joffrey. So Joffrey has all those same problems as the Crimean Knights. In fact, his problem's even worse because he's only available on that part 2 chapter and then that part 3 chapter, and then not until the end of part 4. But he is by far your best unit in the part 2 chapter and the part 3 chapter. I would highly recommend Master Crowning him. It makes the part 3 chapter, Crimean Knights chapter, way easier. I do think that makes him the best of the Crimean Knights. And he is genuinely valuable. I mean, he's the best unit by a lot for 2 chapters. Without him, those chapters would be nightmares. What do you want to rank him? Maybe C? Maybe C. He's got kind of the same thing as the Laguz Royals going on, where like, he is amazing for the chapter he's on, but it's such a slim portion of the game. I'm going to put him in C. Once you re-recruit him in part 4, he's useless. Don't worry about that. He's just available or good on those 2 chapters, but he is really good on those 2 chapters. Okay, Nyla is available in part 1, but she's only available at times when you have like the Black Knight and stuff. She's good on the Prisoners chapter, I suppose. I'm just going to put her next to Gifka. She's better. I don't think she's quite on par with these two. She doesn't dominate chapters. Well, she does, but it's not as crucial. Maybe she should be a bit higher because she's available in part 1. I'll put her in these are my Laguz Royals that are good in the tower, good at the end game, but also available elsewhere in the game. I think that's a reasonable thing. Yeah, I'll put her in B. Fiona is terrible, but again, like, just being available for part 1 is pretty valuable. I think I'll just put her slightly worse than Meg. I don't know. Don't use her, but if you need someone to just like choke a point on an Iron Man, Fiona can actually have some use. So she can also die, by the way, because there's crit on the chapter she's recruited, and she's a game over condition. So fuck that. Fuck that, but you know, whatever. Then we have Leonardo. Leonardo is really bad. I mentioned how bad archers are. His base stats are terrible, just atrocious. He can deal some chip damage, but it's nearly useless. Again, the fact that he's available on part 1 is nice, but he's really bad. The question is he F tier? I think the fact that he can deal chip damage at range at the most difficult portion of the game does make him at least D tier for me. Probably better than a lot of these pretty useless units. Like, none of these units are important. Leonardo is actually kind of important when you think about it. Joffrey is also important. So I'll put him next to Joffrey. These are both important units. Maybe they should even be at the top of C. Like, these two are genuinely important. Actually, Leonardo's not as important as Joffrey. Joffrey is so crucial. If you don't have Joffrey, especially the part 3 chapter, is so difficult. Whereas not having Leonardo would just make the early game a little more challenging, but not that much. It's still doable. So maybe bottom is C. But he is valuable. Don't use him, though. He's atrocious. Do not use him. He's awful. Then we have Garrett. I don't know. Garrett's really bad. He's just really a worse version of Enna and Kurth. I don't think he's as bad as these units. Maybe there. I don't know. An F tier unit. I actually didn't expect F to be this. I'm going to have to lengthen this. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. There she is. I didn't expect to put this many people in F. By the way, I know I've mentioned this a bunch of times, but some of these units should probably be in D. But fuck it. I hate all these units. So they're in F. Then we have Skrimir. He's kind of a Lagoose Royal, but he doesn't get Form Shift, which is definitely a problem. He's only really good for exactly 2 chapters in part 4, and he's not that valuable in those 2 chapters. But he is good in the Desert chapter. It's hard for me to say that I don't think he's an F tier unit, not by any means. Maybe like D. He is good, especially on the Desert chapter, because if you brought flyers, you don't really need him. But if you didn't, or even if you have them, he can still be pretty good. So because he can move in the desert pretty efficiently. All right, next up we have Mordecai. So Mordecai is a lot of the same stuff that I'm going to talk about with Mordecai goes for Leith. They're both available for a few chapters in part 2, and they're really, really good and really important on those few chapters. Leith, Mordecai, Braum, Nephany, all these characters are going to fall into that. Once you get to part 3, all these characters are pretty awful. I wouldn't recommend training or using them at all, but in part 2, they are pretty valuable. And that carries a decent amount of weight for me. Mordecai isn't as important as Joffrey, but he is better for more chapters, so I think I'll put him high C. I do think he's good. I would recommend using him quite a bit on all the chapters he's available, at least in part 2. But again, once you get to part 3, it kind of falls off. So then we have Zahark. Zahark, Tyranio, and Jill are recruited a bit late in part 1 to be really valuable, but the nice thing about Zahark is that he is already a promoted unit, and having promoted units in the Dawn Brigade is really useful. Once you get to part 3, Zahark isn't really that useful because he just cannot take hits. I feel like I've heard a lot of positivity around Zahark. People seem to really like him. I like him, but not that much. I think I'm going to put him just with Tyranio. I think these two have a similar usage. Zahark's probably better because he's available for part 1 a lot more. He is really good on part 1. Maybe that makes him better. I don't know. I don't like Zahark that much. I don't see why people think he's fantastic. He cannot take a hit to save his life, and he doesn't do that much damage. So once you get to part 3, part 1 Zahark, amazing, fantastic. Soniki's really bad. I think she has to come to the tower, so there's a little bit of usage in that, but frankly, like, this is probably an F tier unit. Definitely worse than these two. She's available in part 4, but outside of dealing some chip damage to set kills, like, that's such a mediocre thing to be able to do. She's really bad. She's really bad. The one nice thing about Soniki is that even when you get to the tower, she can still deal big chip damage. I don't know that that's better than the ties that these two give you. I'm going to put them all together. Next up, we have Morim. Morim is very similar to Tormund and Vika. The one thing that Tormund has going, that Morim has going for him, other than just being insanely fucking good in part 1, is that he's actually still usable sort of in part 4, which is sort of funny. I'm going to put him just slightly better than Tormund because I do think he's better and more useful than Tormund, but frankly, like, again, availability, huge issue. For anyone that doesn't know, the availability issue I mentioned with Tormund also works for Vika and Morim. They are recruited and available for half-ish of part 1, and then not re-recruited again until essentially the second to last chapter in the game. So really bad. Next up, we have Sigrun. Sigrun's recruited in like the mid of part 3, which isn't great, but she comes level 19, so it's really easy to promote her. That is pretty cool. Still, her niche is pretty weak. I think I'll put her at the top of D. You can promote her. Sorry, I'm gonna have to. I should have thought about this before I did this. Yeah, I just don't think she's that good. The fact that you can promote her right away is pretty nice, but her stats post-promotion aren't that good. You don't really need it for part 3, and then in part 4, she's pretty darn weak. So I do still think she's okay, just because, again, you get a new one to part 3 to tier 3, they're going to be pretty powerful. But yeah, not much to say about her. She's pretty weak. Oliver, the ultimate meme unit, very similar to Renning. He's recruited just for the tower, and I will say I do think Oliver has a little bit more usage because he has a high staff rank. And I mentioned the healing isn't very good, but you can use like sleep and stuff, and Oliver can do that. I still don't think that he's that much better than Renning, but you know, you can do some more cool things with him. I'll make him better than Renning, but they're both pretty weak. Next up, we have Kieran. Kieran is basically just the same as all these other units. I do think that he's the best non-Joffrey unit of the Crimean Knights. He still sort of holds his own when you get to that part 3 chapter, but once they're recruited, Kieran again can sort of hold his own, and he does come level 10, which is a good level, but you really shouldn't train him. I don't think he's great. It's just a Crimean Knight. Okay, next character. If you watched my playthrough, if you've heard me talk about Radiant Dawn, this is the character that I have the most controversial opinion about. Fucking Jill, man. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about why people really like Jill and also why I don't like Jill, because I've had a lot of conversations regarding her. And if anyone wants to add anything in the comments, feel free. By the way, this is annoying me how it's cutting off the, sorry. All right, why do people like Jill? She is a fantastic class. Draco Knight is broken in this game. It is flying, and other than Thunder Magic, nothing is effective, which is great. Part of the problem with flyers in this game is that crossbows are really strong in sort of bows, but especially crossbows. Jill doesn't have that problem. She also comes with pretty decent stats, at least if you promote her quickly. She's also level 12, which is a good level. She already has like 15 speed, which is nice. She can use axes, which is great. And I've also heard that she's a really great place to put your stat boosters. So you can put like Trigger Shield, Speed Ring, Robe, all these things that you get at the beginning of the game. And she ends up being really, really strong. Probably your best unit for part 3 if you promote her. So those are the reasons to use Jill. And again, feel free to add anything in the comments if there's anything I missed. The reasons I don't like Jill are because she's recruited too late in part 1. You know, Zahark and Tyranio are also recruited fairly late in part 1, but they're both exceptional combat units. Tyranio is nearly invincible outside of that one hammer in part 1, and Zahark is really strong as well. Jill's stats, while they are pretty decent for her level, are not very strong. 15 speed is not enough to double anything, and while her defense is pretty solid, her 24 HP leaves a lot to be desired. I also don't really love the argument of giving her a lot of stat boosters, because I think giving those to like Nolan or Micaiah for better combat or, you know, more safe strats is a much better place to put them. So now I will say this. I think Nolan is the best unit to train in part 1, and I still think Nolan's better than Jill, which I know a lot of people disagree with. The question is, who is the other unit that you should train in part 1? And I think that Jill is probably that unit. There was a while where I was a big Aaron fan, and we'll talk about Aaron a little bit later, but I've come around to the point where I think Jill is probably the second best unit to train in part 1, and probably where you should dump your experience. Now, I think a lot of people would put her in either S or probably A. In the past, I would probably put her in like maybe even C, but I think that's crazy. I think either B or A. Is she an A tier unit? I don't think so, because I think the most difficult part of the game is part 1, and I don't think she's very good in part 1, or at least not the portions of part 1 where you really need good combat. So I'm going to put her at the top of B. Again, my Jill opinion, very controversial. If there's one thing on this list that's controversial, it's definitely that. So feel free. I'm sure people will comment. Feel free to look down below. And if you want to explain why you think Jill is fantastic or should be higher, as with all my tier lists, feel free to explain in the comments. I think it's valuable for not only myself, but also people that watch this video. But yeah, I just don't think, and again, I'm still putting her at the top of B. Like, I still do think she should be trained in part 1. You should use her every time. Maybe that means she's an A tier unit, but again, she's just not that good in part 1. And I don't like that unless you give her stat boosters. So that's my opinion. Anyways, next up we have Soth. Soth I do think is an A tier unit. Excuse me. Soth is absolutely insane. He should probably be even higher, right? Like, I think Soth is amazing. Again, I think the most difficult portion of the game is the very early game, because the enemies are really strong. Your team sucks, and Soth is by far your best unit. Nolan is great too, and Nolan will be better in part 3 if you train him, but Soth is still pretty valuable in part 3, especially with the Beast Killer from part 1. Even though he does fall off a bit, and he's just so good in part 1. He's so important. Like, he is the Jagan of this game, flat out. He's the Jagan of this game. And just like with all Jagans, he's amazing. I don't think that he's an S tier unit quite, but I am kind of teetering. Like, I do think Soth is amazing, and you should use Soth every time. Like, you need Soth in hard mode. He's so important. Maybe that makes him an S tier unit, but for me, there's one unit in this game that goes so above and beyond that it's hard to not put them in S. Next up, we have Leith. Leith, to me, is very similar to Mordecai. They both serve a very similar purpose. She's definitely worse because, again, she's a cat, but she is fast enough to double in part 2. So her combat is there with Mordecai, and she's still pretty bulky. Like, Lagoose HP is really good in this game, so she's worse than Mordecai, but for all the same reasons, she's, I think, a solid unit in part 2. Okay, next up, we have Micaiah. Okay, so Micaiah, I think I'm also a bit controversial about. Actually, up there you can see I have a lovely Micaiah looking. I forgot to put that there actually. But yeah, a lot of people like to say that Micaiah is a terrible lord. I don't think so. I actually think Micaiah is a pretty darn strong lord in the history of Fire Emblem. Like, to me, bad lords are like Lyn, or like Eliwood's pretty bad. Roy kind of, but Roy can do some stuff. Like, Micaiah can hit really fucking hard. Like, yes, she can't take hits. Yes, of course she can't take hits, but Dani is effective against Cavaliers and Knights, of which you will struggle to kill and encounter a decent amount in part 1, at least as the part progresses. And even without that, Dani hits really fucking hard. She's like Leonardo, but can actually hit hard. And like Leonardo is like a low C tier unit. Like I think Micaiah is genuinely pretty good. You can also sacrifice, which gives you a little healing ability, and then of course you can heal when you get to part 3. I don't think she's like an A tier unit or anything, but I don't know. I don't see why Micaiah is so bad. Like I think Micaiah is genuinely quite strong. Once you get to part 3, she still can only deal the chip damage, but that's still useful. And then past that, who gives a shit, right? Then this stuff doesn't matter. So yeah, I don't know exactly where she should be. I'm gonna put her at the top of B. It's hard for me to put her above Jill. Oh, fuck it. She's better than Jill. Fuck it. I don't know, man. I just don't understand why Micaiah is so bad. Like, she's good, man. She hits really hard. I like Micaiah. I'm probably wrong, but I like Micaiah. Anyways, next up is Nelucci. Nelucci's availability is also very fractured. He's available in part 2 and then not again, I think, until part 4, and he's fallen off a cliff at that point. But he still pretty much serves the same purpose that Leith and Mordecai do, so sure. He basically does the same stuff. He's good in part 2. Doesn't really matter after that. Yeah, that's about it. Kanengus is basically just a slightly better Gifka. He has Form Shift, but again, with the gem on Gifka, that doesn't matter. Yeah, really good at the end of the game. Would highly recommend using. He's insanely good. One of the most fun units. That's one of the things I love about Radiant Dawn. The fact that you get to use all these cool, Laguz Lords and really powerful characters you didn't get to interact with. At least you didn't get to see in combat, I should say, in Path of Radiance. So he's a really cool unit, but just not available for that much of time. Then we have Lucia. So Lucia's good on one chapter in part 2, because that's all she's available for, and then re-recruited in part 4 where she's terrible. So probably an F tier unit. Yeah, probably an F tier unit. Sure. Well, these are available for more time, actually. Yeah, she's just not good. You can Master Crown her in part 4, and she can kind of do something, but that's Tabarn's part 4. I think she's locked to, because she's got to be with Alencia, and you're just going to kill everything with Tabarn, so who gives a shit? All right, Ileana, a very interesting unit. In fact, one of my favorite units from this game because she's so interesting. Now, as a unit, she's like fine, whatever. She's useful in part 1, which I value quite a bit. So I think as a unit, devoid of her other utility, which we'll talk about in a second, she'd probably be like a C tier unit, maybe even B. Like, she is good when part 1 is really difficult for at least a little bit, and she can deal good chip damage. She's kind of like Micaiah, actually, but a little bit weaker. But Ileana has extra value because Ileana is the best bridge between the Dawn Brigade and the Grail Mercenaries, meaning that her job to give money, Paragon, Celerity, other skills, whatever you want from part 1 to part 3, is invaluable. Now, how do you want to put her on the tier list considering that? Given how much utility she already has, I think I'm going to put her in B, maybe even higher. Sure, we'll just put you know what? Fuck it. She's better than Jill. Nah, she's probably not better than Jill. It depends on how you want to rank that utility, because that utility is really nice. Like, your time going through the game, it's not necessary, but your time going through the game will be a lot easier if you have Ileana bring stuff to the Grail Mercenaries. So, and she is good in part 1. She's pretty good in part 1. So, I don't know. She should be lower, maybe, but she is valuable. Then we have Har. Of course, yeah. We all knew who was going to be the S tier. Har is one of the best units probably in Fire Emblem history. He is so busted. Kind of similar to Milady from Fire Emblem 6, but except that, again, other than Thunder Tomes, nothing can touch this dude. He has insane bulk. He can fly. His speed, once you get him to tier 3, will come to the point where you can double basically every unit, and he hits like a truck. If you get him... I can't remember what it's called, but whatever makes it so effective stuff isn't effective against you in part 1, you don't even have to worry about Thunder stuff anymore. He's just obscenely broken. He's available for a couple of chapters in part 2 where he's your best unit by a lot, and then he's available very early in part 3 where I would highly recommend training him, and he will be your best unit for all of part 3. He even remains really good in part 4, like still really good, and you can bring him to the tower, and while he will be well behind the Laguz Royals and stuff, he'll probably still be like your strongest unit, at least of the units that you're bringing from your party that's not named like Ike. So yeah, not much to say about him. Insanely busted. Next up we have Nasir. So Nasir is another one of these dragons that gives the pool ability. That's all he does. But Nasir, I believe, is the one that gives +5 speed, I think, which is really valuable because it lets you reach a lot of speed thresholds that you need for the end game. Does that make him that valuable? No, probably not. Probably still an F tier unit. Not really that important or valuable. I think Nasir is really important for some strats, but for our purposes, not a particularly useful unit. He's only available for like 2 chapters. Next up we have Stefan. Stefan is similar to Renning and Oliver. He's technically available for some of a chapter outside of the tower, which is kind of cool, but frankly, he's just as bad as those guys. So you can bring him to the tower if you really need a unit, but you'll have the Laguzarels at that point, so who cares? Then we have Braum. Braum is pretty similar to Mordecai, Leith, and Nelucci. He is really valuable in part 2, especially on that first chapter where he's by far your best unit, because Nephany and especially Heather kind of blow. But once you get past part 2, he's not particularly valuable. I do think that bumps him up to B. Like, he's available for, I think, every part 2 chapter outside of the Crimean Knights. So, and he is valuable. But again, once you re-recruit him on the Mercenaries, although to be honest, you can train him on the Mercenaries. Like, I'm sure he's not terrible. But yeah, just super valuable in part 2. Next up, we have Mia. So Mia's kind of weird, right? Because she can double, which is really valuable for the Mercenaries. She seems really weak at first, but she's one of the best places to put your experience with the Mercenaries. She's probably the 3rd best Mercenary behind Titania and Ike, right? Does that make her A tier? Probably not. I think I'm going to put her in B, maybe somewhere around here. Shit, I'm going to have to do this with the... last time we have to do this. Hopefully. Actually, that might not even be true. Whatever, you can see the top of their faces. That's good enough. She's good. She's super fun to use. I would highly recommend putting experience into her. Like I said, I think she's probably the 3rd, but maybe Gatry's better. I don't know. She can double. If you promote her, she can hit hard. Dodge taking in this game is always a little bit scary. I'll talk about this more with Edward because of the way that biorhythm works, and a lot of people just have really good hit. But Mia has really good avoid and can take hits at least reasonably well. So I like Mia a lot. I think she's probably the 3rd best Mercenary, even if she's a little weak at first. Then we have Volk. Unlike Oliver, Renning, and Stefan, Volk is available for 1 chapter in part 4, but I don't really think that makes him that good. I still think that makes him one of the worst units. He gets lethality, which is really fun, much better than Bane that Whispers get in this game, but he still is unfortunately locked to knives, which is really bad, and again, it's going to be overshadowed by a lot of the strong units you're getting at that point. Then we have Aaron. Okay, so I mentioned before that I used to be a big believer in Aaron, and I've kind of dropped out of that. I like Aaron because even though he comes really weak, what you really want for part 3 Dawn Brigade chapters is defense, because they're all defend chapters, and Aaron provides that. He has a 70% growth in strength, skill, and defense, which is really good. So I used to really like him. Now I've kind of come to the conclusion that, again, it's better to train Jill, but I don't think he's a terrible place to put your experience, because you will have enough defense to take hits pretty well in part 3. He does get doubled, that's part of the problem, but so I think at this point I'm probably more in line of like a C tier unit, maybe high C, maybe he doesn't even belong, maybe he doesn't even deserve that anymore. Ah, what am I doing? Hold on. Okay, I'm gonna make this smaller so we can actually see. This should work, right? I think I'm gonna have to do it one more time because I'm probably gonna add someone to see. Whatever. My own technical issues aside. Yeah, now where did I put him? At the top of C? I think that's a good place for him. He's still pretty useful. Like, he's still recruited early, and even though his stats kind of suck, like, he can still do something. And even though I don't like relying on growth units, 70% is a really high growth, especially to having that many stats. So again, I have fallen off him a bit, but I still think he's a solid unit. I still think he's a decent place to put your experience if you want. And he's still valuable in part 1, just as a decently statted unit that can take hits. So next up we have Tanith. Tanith is really just a worse Sigrun because she can't promote really quickly. Sigrun, the only reason Sigrun's at the top of D is really because she can promote so quickly if you want. So Tanith without that is probably more of like a bottom tier D unit. She's recruited late like Sigrun. She's not as good, so pretty simple there. Next up we have Gatry. Gatry is another, I think, really good not Dawn Brigade. I wish, oh my god. Grell Mercenaries unit. He comes with really good HP, strength, and defense, and he actually has a really good speed. His speed growth is like 60% or something crazy like that. Unfortunately, his speed cap's kind of blow, but that doesn't really matter that much in part 3. He's either slightly worse or slightly better than Mia. He's better than Mia at the beginning, and then Mia probably becomes better, but I think he's really good. I think he's also a really good place to put your experience with the Grell Mercenaries. So Next up, we have Shinon. I think Shinon is a huge fan favorite. I used to be a huge fan of Shinon. The problem with Shinon is obvious. It's that he's a sniper, and snipers are really, really bad. They do have crossbows in this game, but I mentioned earlier that unless you're dealing effective damage, crossbows really, really stink. The great thing about Shinon is that his stats are insane. He can double right off the bat, which is difficult for most of the mercenaries. He hits pretty hard. He has really good HP and really good defense. It's just his goddamn class. I wouldn't really recommend training Shinon, as characters like Mia, Titania, Gatry are way better, but I think the fact that even if you don't promote him, he's still, useful all the way throughout part 3. I think he's worse than Gatry and Mia, but I do think he's still really strong, and I would recommend using him a lot. Even if, again, his class holds him back a ton. Marksman does get 3 range in this game, which is cool, but again, we need 1-2 range. 3 range does not fix his problems. Next up, we have Soren. Soren is definitely one of the worst of the mercenaries. I think he's slightly better than Boyd, just because he can deal damage at range, which I like. But he's probably worse than Boyd, actually. He's just not very good. He has really good magic, but his speed growth stinks, and you really, really need speed. If you promote him, he can be a pretty strong unit, but he's still pretty frail, so I don't really like him that much. But dealing big chunk damage at range is kind of valuable, so not terrible. Then we have Janef. Again, Janef, very similar to Yoki. Whatever I talked about with Yoki earlier basically goes second with Janef. I think Janef is slightly worse, again, because of the ability, but they're both very comparable, so not much to say. Then we have Nephany. So Nephany is... It's weird because she's a lot worse than Braum, but she is... she has better availability because she's available in that first chapter, and she's so important than, Mordecai, Leith, Nelucci, but she's worse than those 3 characters, and she's a lot worse than Braum. I kind of want to put her here. I also kind of want to put her here. I think I'm going to put her there. She's worse than Braum, for sure. At first she gets weighed down by the Steel Great Lance, which sucks. She's so bad on that first chapter, although she is important because she's one of 3 units. And then once you get the Great Lance offer, she's a lot better, but she's still really not that strong. So similar to Braum, you can train her once you get to part 3, but you're really better off training basically everyone else. So yeah, I just don't think she's that good. I could see her being here. I could definitely see her being there, but I'll just put her as slightly better than these units. Not as important as Joffrey, because Braum is the more important unit in my opinion. And then last up we have Edward, one of the most fun units to use in the game, and I think a huge fan favorite, but not a unit I like particularly well. Again, for me, Edward is not very good in part 1. He's okay in that first chapter and can give you a little bit of combat, but you have to give him levels, and he has to get speed, of which he does pretty consistently, but he has to get speed to consistently double. He doesn't take hits well. He doesn't deal that much damage. If you put a lot of effort into him, you end up with this really frail unit for part 3. If you train him alongside Nolan, maybe, but again, I really want bulk for part 3. Still, the fact that he's available early is really valuable. He's definitely a better Leonardo. So I think B tier is pretty reasonable for him. Maybe I'll do this. Maybe I'll do this. I think maybe I like this a little bit better, because I think Aaron is the better unit to train. Aaron is better in part 3 if you train him, but Edward is better in part 1 just overall, I think. Although even then, Edward falls off so fast. I don't know. I think the fact that it's pretty easy to train Edward, and if you do, you get a pretty competent unit, makes him a B tier unit. And again, I value early game Dawn Brigade stuff a lot, but I could see him being down in C. I do think he's an option. Like I said, I think Nolan is the best unit to train. Jill is the second best. Aaron is the third best. Edward is probably the fourth best. So that's not great, but it's not terrible. And you also already have Zahark. Edward is just Zahark, but you already have Zahark. So it's I don't know. Anyways, we're almost at an hour. So if you stuck with me this long, holy fuck, welcome to the end of the video. That would surprise me. I know a lot of people probably just look at the tier list, so for those that are doing that, welcome. Again, as always, feel free to post any questions. Actually, can I make this bigger? So people, actually, that's just useless at this point. Here, for anyone who only wants to see the tier list, this should be the best view of it I can give you, something like that. Snapshot that, whatever. Sorry that my face is here, but yeah, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to post them down below. Again, Radiant Dawn I think is a really hard game to evaluate, especially in a tier list like this. As I've said a million times, it's much more important to hear what I have to say rather than where I rank the units. And I'm also not an expert at this game, so yeah, I would highly recommend reading the comments because there's probably a lot of interesting stuff to say, and I'll probably respond to everybody as I normally do. So In any case, like I said, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. I really hope you enjoyed. I like making these tier lists. We've actually just started Shadow Dragon, which I know Shadow Dragon is not a very popular game. I know a lot of people don't want to see that. After we finish that, I will make a tier list for Shadow Dragon. But yeah, we'll keep going with the tier lists. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your night or whenever you're watching this, I guess. And I will see you in the next one.